We have to wait till 7 seconds. Well, happy Friday, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning. Nate.
What's going on, Nick?
Happy to see you here.
Likewise.
Everybody, well, if you're new to the B2B Power Hour, thanks for joining us today. Usually it's me and Morgan Smith, but as you can see, we got Nate. And if you guys haven't downloaded his playbook yet, it will help you fluently speak customer, which...
I like what you did there. It was nice.
I was trying to go and do it as well as you did during our podcast interview, but you just made it. It was so smooth. I couldn't quite do it.
Well, what I like about this is people can see me like winking, when I drop a nod or a little hint. On a podcast, it's just the audio. So we'll try to slide it in there at some point today.
Yeah, I appreciate it. We've got a lot of questions today about why deals are dying after the demo. And it's kind of all over the place. Some people it's earlier in the process. Some people it's later in the process. But I think it'd be really interesting, just while people are joining us, I'd love for you to go and dive in how you even came across this in the first place. I think it's such a great story.
Well, I guess I'll set it up with kind of my own background, developing enterprise deals, how I kind of got on this whole kick. And, we'll see if I'm smart enough or maybe stupid enough to go build a company around this. But I'll kind of tell that story and then maybe leave it with like one foundational kind of takeaway after that. So the main idea that I've seen that I don't think is really talked about quite enough is the fact that all of the make or break conversations in a large or a complex sales process are typically happening when a sales rep isn't in the room. Instead, it's when the buyers are together, because all of the moments that create or kill deals are happening in those internal discussions. And it's in those discussions where buyers are talking about all of the different problems that exist, the level of priority that they have, and what they think they should do about it. They're trying to deconflict all of these different opinions and all of these different projects that are flying around the organization and trying to figure out, what do we do here? So what I discovered is that more than anything, like the art of an effective B2B sales process is internal communications. You're trying to figure out, what is it that my buyers already have in mind? What's happening in those internal discussions, and how can I build a narrative or a message that includes my product to engage not only the first buyer that I meet with, but everybody else that's a part of the buying circle. So for me, what I discovered and went kind of very deep down into is this idea of crafting internal narratives in developing memos with the buyers that I was working with to share and circulate that to the rest of the buying circle. And on one particular deal, I remember it looked like a blank Google Doc, where one day when we were talking, I just opened up a blank Google Doc and started writing down exactly what this buyer, Christina, that I was working with, was saying about what's going on in their organization and what she's talking to her team about. And using that, kind of long story short, I was able to close $1 million in Google Docs over the next 3 months by developing an internal narrative with different buyers in order to engage them. Now, the reason why this relates to this whole idea of why do deals die after the demo, I'll spend maybe like 2 minutes on this to kind of set up, maybe provide a little arc to the conversation, and then we could dig a little deeper with questions that everybody was submitting, which, by the way, that's what makes us fun, is when people write in with questions. I know we got a ton ahead of time, but also looks like we got some great people showing up live here with us as well. So here's why this is important and why this matters, is that when you look at the number one reason why deals die out, it's because the seller didn't do a good job of separating project risk from product risk. And what I mean by that is the number one reasons that you lose pipeline is that, one, there's no decision. It just ends in nothing. And that's like roughly 40% of deals. It'll vary kind of plus or minus based on who the seller is, the industry that you're working in. Or second, other decisions are prioritized. So no decisions or another decision was made. And the reason why I talk about first no decisions, because that's a big chunk of it, is that by and large, nobody cared. Like, you weren't talking about a problem that mattered to enough people in a way that it was compelling, or you were talking about it in a way where the perceived level of, call it, risk or level of effort to change superseded that, number one. Or number two, other decisions were prioritized. And the reason why I talk about that is oftentimes we like to think about competition in a deal as like another vendor or somebody else who has a similar type of software to what we do. But every organization has a budget and they're thinking about, okay, with my finite limited resources, what's the best and highest use of that? So for example, if you're selling, call it like customer experience software, and you have 500K available, for a big new project, you could go invest in maybe a system for triaging technical support tickets, a predictive model for churn analysis, so many different things that you could do. And the only way to understand if you are in a position to actually move a deal forward without it dying on you is to figure out, like, what is the CEO talking to the chief customer officer about? If you're not aligned with that, or you're not influencing or shaping that conversation as a sales rep, chances are that another project entirely got prioritized. So I guess I'll frame it up there, and I'll say typically that's something that I find is missing from the conversation. And Jacob, I saw your note. Sounds like doc.us, a little different, because what it comes down to is messaging as opposed to just sharing information about a product and posting it in some type of room that looks good, is accessible. It all comes down to the art of finding and framing a problem that matters to a lot of people and developing a message or a narrative around that. How you communicate that, you can do that in a number of different ways, but that's the key practice.
Yeah, absolutely. How many deals have you opened and the champion is so excited, they're ready to get going, and then they go back and then nothing. Crickets, nothing happens. And you're like, so what happened? Did you follow up with them? It's not a priority right now, or we don't have the budget, or you get these kind of, soft rebuttals, but the reality is when they went to go and present that information, it wasn't compelling. And the
Yep.
thing that I love that you say is you 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 change the formatting so that it looks like an internal memo. So
Hmm.
it's their communication, and you're empowering them to communicate in the way that is the most natural to them, instead of trying to like pull them down into the sales process the way that's normal for you or faster for you or your preferred choice. You're really putting them at the forefront of everything
Hmm.
and being part of that journey and empowering them.
Yeah, that's right. Jacob is commenting on this. It's not about like a fancy over the top doc, it's about the message. And then, Nick, what you're raising on that point is this whole idea of internal camouflage. Like part of your job as a sales rep is to enable your champion to go share that message effectively with everybody else. The most effective way to do that is to reduce any type of friction in asking buyers to work in a way that is unfamiliar to them. And so, if you can align what you're sharing with that champion so that it looks like what everybody else is already accustomed to, it's going to be received far better. And I've been fascinated by how creative a lot of the account executives that I'm talking with are getting. For example, earlier this week, I was talking with an AE at Clearbit, and I was asking him, it you were mentioning that you're one of the higher performing reps. He actually started as an account manager, is now managing a whole portfolio of new sales as well. So he's doing both new sales and upsells. I was like, how did you get to a place where your team was trusting you to manage such a wide portfolio of deals? And he talked about how when he shares materials and gives a message to his champion, he uses the same system that they use. So, for example, he was showing me a Notion page from one buyer that operates in Notion. So he opened up a Notion account and built out the message with his champion there. Another one
Wow.
used Coda. So he opened up a Coda account. He showed me a Miro board for another group that was using Miro. And just the versatility to think about, like, what are my buyers doing internally? How are they talking together about the different projects that they have going on? And how can I, instead of asking them to change and follow my process, align myself with theirs? It's phenomenal. I mean, impressive how creative a lot of the AEs are getting that I'm meeting every week.
Yeah, that presentation just it changes the whole way that it's received, because now it doesn't people aren't getting that pattern recognition of like, oh, this somebody's
Mhm.
trying to sell me something. You're actually breaking down that social barrier and saying, this is our team talking. So then it's all about the quality of the message and not the format.
Mhm. That's that's right on. And I like the comment that Michael just dropped in the chat too. And not just a compelling message, Many salespeople rely on the demo to do the close for them. I mean, I agree. If you think about what's most compelling to the buying team, it's their problems and the payoff that they're looking for if that problem is solved, as opposed to the feature. Most people I find are generally agnostic as to the right way to go about solving something. They just know that they got a problem that is wicked painful, and they know that they want something, a different reality. And if you can get them there, that's the whole point of the demo, is just to say, hey, we have something that can help. But if you go too deep into features and so on, you begin to stray from the message that matters. You need to share just enough for them to see the bridge between the problem and the payoff. That, number one, is the key point of the demo. And then number two, it just depends on the user or the audience. You may have somebody who is, let's say, at an associate level, whose whole life is spent inside of a certain tool. Like, yeah, you will need to show much more features to build that bridge in their mind. But if you think about all of the different buying roles and everybody in the buying team, the message has to work on many different levels. If you're an executive versus an analyst, like a demo, you're going to look at a demo totally different. So anyway, Michael, some quick thoughts on your point. I think it was a great ad.
I just want to pause, and anybody that's in the chat today, please let me know. Have you read Nate's playbook? If you haven't, please send. And after the show today, I'll make sure everybody gets a copy. And what is the biggest excuse you hear about customers killing a deal?
About customers killing a deal. The excuse implies it's not valid, or it's not a kind of, call it, worthwhile reason. For me is, well, I don't know. That they weren't responding to me. I sent them like 5 messages being like, hey, can we schedule that follow-up call? Did you see the Calendly link? Did your VP schedule that meeting yet? And the reason why I don't think that's a valid excuse is because the seller in their follow-up, the checking in, it's coming from a selfish place of, hey, I have a deal review with my VP coming up and I need to give them a status update. You give me a status update. And it's built on this idea or this premise that, well, people don't follow up with me because they just forgot and therefore they need a reminder, as opposed to a statement of value. People aren't seeing the reason why they should carve out 30 minutes times maybe 3 people that I want to join this meeting from their week and give that time to me. And instead, so this comes back to your question, the reason why I wouldn't call that a valid excuse is because it's ultimately on the sales rep to move the deal forward in a thoughtful, creative way, because by default, every single deal that enters your pipeline is dead. And I think most people say, well, I qualify them, they're in my pipeline. Like, this is an active, a viable deal. It should keep moving forward by default. And so the mindset that I take, and the reason why I would call this an invalid excuse, is that you actually got to flip it and just realize, like, hey, everything that enters your pipeline, it's dead unless you do something about it to move it forward. And that's the seller's job, not the buyer's job.
I couldn't agree more. And the reason why I was framing it that way is I wanted to hear some of the reasons why people think deals are dying. And this week, one of the most common ones, when people would give me their, like, this is what they said, this is what happened. Any guesses on what the top one was?
Oh, I like this. I'm going to say no budget. People think, hey, there's no budget here, so therefore, the pricing, the spend didn't work out.
Yeah.
What is it?
It was that one, and then there was one that was really close, and that was, we just need more information. They were almost tied, but it was interesting. So when I did a little bit of digging, I was like, okay, tell me about the sales process. Like, what actually happened? Guess what got skipped?
I'm going to say discovery. Discovery was skipped, or it was too shallow if it was done.
Yeah, they did like a 5-minute, like, what should we show in the demo? They asked, and then they jumped right into the demonstration, but there was no questions. There was no depth. There was no problem with pain. It was just show and go.
Yeah, classic. And so Anders put this in not a priority, right below budget. So Michael nailed it. Budget number 1, not a priority. I'm going to put that on kind of an equivalent plane with the, just send me some info. And I mean, if you haven't uncovered a meaningful problem, how could it be a priority? That's because, again, it was either skipped or shallow demo.
Yeah. And One of the other things, and I see this all the time in comments in the feed, or I see this like in posts, is
Mm-hmm.
people are pitching too early, and the way they're opening up the deal is shallow.
Mm-hmm.
And so when me and you can't have a conversation about what's actually going on, and all we're talking about is my product, I could open up my spam folder right now and I can see a lot of I'm amazing, I'm amazing emails. They're
Mm-hmm.
so easy to ignore. But what do you do when you're talking to the friend? Like, honestly, it's one of the reasons I love talking to you, Nate, is I can tell you care and the quality of your questions really dive deep.
Hmm.
So it's easy for us to have a good conversation. But, if you flip it around and all you ever cared about is what you could sell me, people feel that. And that comes across in your sales process.
Oh yeah. So I posted about this yesterday. It was this kind of like light bulb moment for me. It was just a good reminder to come back to exactly what you're saying time and time again. So I was talking with an AE and walking him through Fluent to see if he wanted to jump onto our beta. And his comment to me was when I was kind of asking like, this is a new tool. Why would you even spend time considering this or talking to me? And his point was, I'm trying to develop a personal operating system, a way to get myself an edge in sales. And I was like, well, that's interesting. Why do you want an edge in sales? And his point was that I have a new kid on the way. My family is growing, and every deal that I can close faster or every point increase in my win rate is more time with my family. And so I want to figure out how to do my job most effectively in the shortest amount of time because that just goes right back into the family. And I'm like, that is an awesome reason to be looking at this tool because that ultimately at the end of the day is what it's about. And to your point around discovery is like, what's the thing that matters most to this person? And typically it's a couple layers deep. It's not related to any type of workflow or even in this case, closing a deal. The reason why he wanted to close more deals is because there was the family back there. And that is the goal of discovery is like, what is that like internal sense of urgency or driver or motivator? And that's why it's like something that you got to find. You can't create that in the sales process. You can only uncover that, and that's the goal of discovery.
So, I love this. I love this. What would be your make or break to actually do a presentation? What would So if you had to go and draw a line in the sand and you're like, never present before this, what would you put
Yeah.
on that list?
So it depends on who it is that is receiving the presentation. So if you're talking executive presentation versus analyst presentation, obviously you're drawing those lines in different places. So I'll start at the analyst level first.
Yeah.
So when I think about the right time to make a presentation is one, you've discovered what matters. Two, you've uncovered their view of what must be true in the right, call it solution or approach to solving a problem so that you actually know what it is that you want to show them. And if you have those two pieces, then beginning to open up a presentation or demo, I think is great, especially because at an analyst level, if you think about the percentage of their week that they're spending in a tool, they are typically very linear and interested in the specifics of how this thing is actually going to function. And if you delay too long, so if you draw that line too late in the sales cycle, then you're actually losing trust because there's not enough of a concrete visual or understanding in their mind, and they're starting to feel antsy and restless and feeling like you're just at that point you become the obstacle preventing them from accessing the information that they're interested in, as opposed to somebody who is trying to figure out how do I present you the most helpful information in the right order so that it is truly resonating and giving you what you need to do your job. Now, when you're talking up at an executive level, when we come back to the demo, oftentimes the way I like to run it is not to have me present that demo, but to have the champion present the first piece and present alongside of me. And so the test of where you're drawing that line is, have you spent enough time with the champion, number one, to understand and develop a message that will resonate at an executive level? Because messaging, and this was actually part of what we dug into in our last episode that we shared this week, is how to think about aligning messaging at the two different levels. So you have to spend enough time to understand the nuance of what the executives are interested in, like what are they talking to their board about. It's going to be very different from a team meeting, let's say at a manager level. But number two, your champion actually has to become fluent enough in your own value in your product to be able to communicate that. You catch that little wink there? Uh-huh.
I love it.
So that's the goal, is that you're actually selling together, you're selling with them. And that only comes after a certain amount of time, quote, fluency in your champion being able to articulate why they think not only your product, but the approach that you're enabling for them is bar none the thing that they need.
I love it. I love every. You're just you make my day. Okay, we have a really good comment, and I think is becoming more prevalent in sales, especially at the enterprise level.
Mm-hmm.
It comes in from Liz. This is why it blows my mind when senior stakeholders request demo, but don't understand why we want to meet more to do discovery. What would you say to that? Like if you're trying to go and tell an executive that's hungry that just wants their information, how would you approach that to either slow it down or make sure it's a more meaningful conversation?
Yeah. So I'm going to answer this with one kind of quick story. So the 2 companies ago, I was part of a senior leadership team. I built the first enterprise sales team, and we would have once a week this meeting with the entire executive staff. It was very expensive because if you think about an hour and a half long meeting with every senior person in the company, times salary and so on, like it's a very expensive thing to get a whole bunch of senior people together once a week. And so the question is like, is this going to move you forward or not, based on the agenda, what's set up in that meeting? And so I remember our CEO one week canceling the meeting last minute because there was no agenda that was laid out by the person who was responsible for organizing the meeting. And I felt terrible for them. I'm like, dang, they just got essentially called out in front of all of the senior level people in the entire company. But his point was, this is the single most expensive thing that we do as a company, this meeting. So if there's no point and we don't understand why we're going into this meeting, why have it? And I like the point that was made here is like, look, this is actually going to be a pretty expensive meeting on your end if you're getting all of these senior people into the room. And if we can't answer what on the other side of this meeting you need to have seen in order to move it forward and say, 1, this was a good use of time, and 2, we want to spend even more time together, then I have no idea how to make this a productive time for you. And so I actually want to do you a service and try to figure out like what needs to be true coming out of this meeting for you to say, let's do another meeting that was such an effective use of time. Honestly, I can't answer that right now. So out of concern for, your team and what you're doing, I'd love to do a quick call to set up an agenda that makes the most sense. Would you be open to that? Typically, I find people are like, oh, that's great. Yeah, I'm up for it. And if it comes back to framing, if it's all framed around what's best for the buyer and a concern for them, as opposed to, well, hey, I want to make sure that I don't fall flat and present something that you don't care about, which, by the way, is the secondary point. But most people will respond well if the messaging is framed around, hey, this is actually out of concern for you. Let's talk about this.
Love it. The most common response I hear to that is, here is my case studies. Go take, these are the top 2 or 3. Let me know what resonates with you. Mm-hmm. And it takes that personal like connection away, and it's framed what's easy for the salesperson. And I know it doesn't feel like that when you're doing it. You feel like you're being helpful, but the way you framed it is, hey, I care about you and I don't want to waste your time because I know it's valuable. So that's why we do this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Are you going to let me help you?
Right on. A term for that I discovered as I was doing just a ton of research over the last 6 months relative to our product. We were talking with a ton of different buyers, and all of them talked about this idea of link stacking. And so the typical follow-up that they get is that there's a library of hyperlinks, different downloads, demo recordings, case studies, and so on. And so the seller more or less pukes all this up in an email and says, here, sort through this and find the stuff that matters to you.
Oh, yeah.
And it's super common. Even if you have some type of enablement system, it makes it even easier to just grab a bunch of links, send them over. And what was fascinating, and I asked the different buyers we were talking to, like, so like, what would you prefer? What does this mean? And they were essentially calling it the treasure hunt. I now have to spend my time hunting through every single attachment to try to figure out what are the 2 sentences that are actually relevant and I want to include in the message, as opposed to you listening to understand, identifying what's most important, curating that, and then sharing it in something more simple that I can go and share with the buying team. And if I go back to this whole idea of how are you adding value to move the deal forward as opposed to putting more work back on the buyer, that's the seller's job as opposed to the buyer's. So don't link stack, in other words.
Makes me think of going to the doctor when they give you like pamphlets and like, here, read this and let me know what you think. And you're like, aren't you the doctor? Shouldn't you be giving me advice? And like,
Uh-huh.
if I knew how to diagnose this, that I wouldn't have come in here.
Yeah.
So it's almost like they're assuming that I know more than they do, or it gives you that feeling of like,
Yeah. I mean,
yeah,
I'll go real personal here for a second. My wife and I have been going through the IVF process trying to grow our family. It's been years of journey. And that's exactly what happens is like we're overwhelmed trying to figure out and make decisions. And we get pamphlets, videos, courses to watch. And we're spending like hours in an evening trying to figure out there are all these different choices that you need to make with incredibly high stakes. And, it's like very hard to get on our doc's calendar. And it's like, man, this is a tough experience for us. It's already highly emotional and it's back on us to try to wade through all of this information and make sense of it because we know we're only going to have 15 minutes in a short virtual telehealth appointment on Friday. And so we got to figure out like how do we make the most of this time? So I'll go back. Let's see, who was it? Lindsay. Lindsay put a great comment earlier. People may not remember the words that you say, but they always remember the way you make them feel. Like, yeah, I totally agree. And what people will feel is like, oh my gosh, Nick went out of his way to try to understand what matters. And then I wasn't expecting it, but he put all of this together for me. Like, my gosh, this is very different from the other teams that I'm talking with. I like Nick. Like I have this expectation or this like anticipation that every time I talk with Nick, he's going to go above and beyond and do something to help me that I wasn't expecting. I love that. Yes, I'm going to respond to Nick's email first when I see it in my inbox. So anyway, the link between and the emotion in the sales process is significant in the feelings that you develop and you help create for the buyer. That's what creates influence. It's not facts and information. It's the feeling that actually creates influence.
thank you for sharing that.
Yeah,
I really appreciate it.
no doubt.
It growing your family is always a fun part of life, and yeah, I feel like the emotion we always shove off, and we don't realize just how much of a play, like how much it controls everything. And like even think of your buyers, they're kind of in that same boat, right? Where they're
Mm-hmm.
if the buyer doesn't feel like you care, or if the buyer doesn't feel like you have that emotional connection, why would they go to bat for you?
Oh, yeah. I totally agree.
Jacob asked a really good question. I think this is something we don't give enough. We don't get taught this. We don't get taught like what framework should we use for discovery? What questions should we be asking? And then you look at proposals and the proposals
Mhm.
are everywhere. They say nothing. They're like, I don't know, a landing page. So how do you create an agenda or a framework for discovery when you sell to so many different personas? So there's a couple of questions in here.
Mhm.
Use cases, which brings in more personas and different levels. Would it be helpful if I left this up for us to go and review as we go through the couple questions in here?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. Where would you like to start?
So let's go in order. So let's talk personas first. So when I think about agenda framework based on personas, there's this idea of language market fit. Each of these different people think about their job and their needs with different language and a different set of terms. And so when you think about the questions that you're asking, um, for example, a lead may mean one thing to sales versus marketing. And so you can't use language that's that general. You need to tighten it up to resonate with that specific person. So I would say in the phrasing and how you are asking your questions, make sure you're using the same language that that particular persona uses to describe their day-to-day, their job, what they're evaluated on. So that's number one. Two, on use cases, sales versus CS, which brings in even more personas. Jacob, I'm kind of curious, by the way, what product or platform you're selling, because it sounds very versatile. Like you cover a lot, which means that you have a very hard job to try to think about and just kind of like on the fly mentally assemble the different, I guess, ways of talking about this. So when it comes to use cases, actually, the way that I would start is higher level, and I would start first based on problem. Try to understand and make all of the discovery oriented around problem, its cost, the consequences, and who's affected by those consequences. Because you may actually begin to develop multiple different use cases inside of a single deal. If you go too deep trying to separate, okay, are you a sales or a CS use case? And let's say, at the highest level, you're just focused on, I don't know, revenue. Let's say you're a revenue application platform. There's lots of them out there like Drift. They work with both sales teams and marketing teams and upsell and account management teams. You may not know the largest driver or what's most important. Is it call it net revenue retention, expansion, and upsell, because that's what investors are most focused on, lifetime value? Or is it earlier stage, so they're only focused on new growth? So I would try to go back to problem and priority before going deep into use case, because you may actually touch a couple of them. And then different levels, manager, director, so on. The simplest way, and then I'll stop here to avoid a continuous monologue here. When I think about different levels, what I'm always trying to do is figure out what does this person care about? Who do they need to talk to? And what does that person care about? Typically one level higher. And I try to identify the difference between those two things. So what do you as the manager care about? If you need to go talk to your director, what does your director care about that is different from you? And that sets up in my mind how I need to connect those two things in a follow-up message to keep the sales process moving. Because my goal will be, one, to speak to what you cared about, manager, but two, not to leave it just there, but to give you something that you can forward on that your director is going to be very interested in. And so I would angle my questions accordingly to uncover both of those two perspectives.
Absolutely. And to play on what you were saying earlier, Nate, it really starts in your prospecting, because when you really understand the customer insights that really dive into why change, why now you can approach them at the right time. And so if you really break apart what that problem is and how it's felt and how frequent that pain is, then it doesn't matter if they're CS, sales, or whatever. There's a specific workflow that's being disrupted or not as good as it could be. So there's an opportunity cost. And so knowing what you do, Jacob, if you can't have the conversations happen at the right time, you lose the opportunity.
Yeah,
so
I
that's
agree.
the main problem. So what workflows does that come up in? And then this is where Nate, they'll have like the case studies and they'll have like where this can show up. And so then it speaks specifically to that workflow. But there is a bigger problem. The problem is too many people dive too deep. And this is where it gets lost, because when you're doing your segmentation, this is where you're building out those silos where it's felt a little differently with a little bit different twist. And so if you align yourself to that, think of how much better your discovery is going to be and how much better your disqualifying is going to be too.
Well said. Well said. Speak of the playbook. So it looked like some people were interested in reading it. There's one specific section that I'll walk through. You should go check this out because it relates back to Jacob, your question around setting up for a good discovery and agenda. And it's a problem statement and a formula for crafting a very effective problem statement. And there is one key element that you just raised, Nick, timing, that's present in the two pieces to that problem statement. So the first is around costs. What is it costing you? Second is around consequences, or like, why are those costs significant? The so what that's behind it. And so when you think about how to develop costs or quantify that within the problem statement, there are three main drivers of it. There's frequency, like how often is this occurring? Reach, how many people is it impacting? And then pain, or its level of intensity, like how severe is this? So a problem that occurs once a year versus once a day, timing makes a big difference in the costs there. And then consequences, is there a certain time by which it needs to be addressed to avoid a second order consequence? So for example, a problem statement may say kind of the basic framework. So every frequency, at least reach, number of people are impacted by pain, like what is the intensity or severity of that pain, which costs us something. And that means this: if it's not addressed by this, then we risk, here's the second order. So if you put that all back into like one actual example, the one that I use in the playbook is of Drift. And so they're kind of big Thing was, hey, instead of using marketing forms, start conversations with customers, you're going to convert more. And so a problem statement that may go up to a CMO, for example, if a marketing team wants to implement Drift, it would be, hey, every single month, 50,000 visitors hit our blog, but only 1% of those convert on our forums, and it costs us 500 demos for our sales team, which means that we're spending more money on paid ads to hit our target. That's driving up our CAC, or our cost to acquire more customers. And if this isn't addressed by the end of the second quarter, we're going to miss both our revenue and our CAC target, which is going to go into the investment memo, let's say, for the Q3 raise. Right? So you've brought all those things together, but it all comes back to this idea around timing is like, this is active and happening every single month, and it's got to be addressed by this timeline. And if you don't have timing that is pulled out during that discovery process, and that's part of that agenda, it's going to be very difficult to move the deal forward. And that's where it comes back to the whole title of today's topic. It's going to die out after the demo.
Not enough people talk about timing. And I notice a lot, even whether you're following BANT or whatever, methodology, if you don't have timing, like budget is based on timeline.
Mm-hmm.
And so if there's no reason why they're pushing to do this and they have no set like drop dead date, if I look back, and it's funny because I was just doing this a couple months ago. We haven't talked about this yet, but I was like, what happened in the deals, the good deals that should have went through but didn't? Well, I thought they were good because I thought the prospect had a problem with pain, but I realized after they just didn't have a timeline set, so there was no sense of urgency, and I missed it. Missed it, so I couldn't communicate that. And by the time it had happened, it stalled, and it's really hard to rebuild that momentum.
Yeah. I think that's kind of interesting because you raise a good point. All of the deals sitting in your closed lost column in your CRM look a lot like all of the other deals that were closed won, just on the surface of it, what the problems were, the pains that they presented with, and so on. So I think that's an interesting point, and I would kind of say two things about it. So one, I'd loop back to this whole idea of like the internal urgency, right? You might have found a problem, but you didn't discover why that matters on a more personal level or a deeper level to this one person. So for example, let's say you're selling, so we use Office Vibe. It's a tool to kind of get a temperature check on culture, how team morale is feeling. It's a survey tool at the end of the day. And so the problem might be like, hey, I've tried so many survey tools. It takes me forever to aggregate all of this stuff and then make sense of the insights. So it costs me a lot of time. It's like, okay, great. That is a problem for sure. But the more personal driver of urgency or the timing in my mind is like, look, every single week that melts by as a founder, when my team thinks that I don't care about them, I'm creating a corrosive culture that is going to set the company back and reflect poorly on me as a founder. My first value in the company is people first. How can I say that that's true every week where I don't bother to dig through all of the insights and make sense of these surveys, right? That's a more meaningful thing. So I again, go back. The internal driver of urgency is going to be a far more effective lever for timing in the deal. Second, like this is a great partnership opportunity between AE and SDR. So do what Nick did. Go back and look at, are there themes, patterns in these closed lost deals that were different, even when they had the same problem from the closed won deal? And if there were certain triggering events, certain things that were present in the closed won deals of like, hey, this happened, therefore they were interested in talking with us. How can you go out and build a prospecting strategy around those signals of when a company posts X number of job openings in this team, that's a good opportunity. Like, let's go prospect them because the timing is right. So I liked your point around the analysis. I just say flow this all the way back up to the top of the funnel and make sure any SDR demand gen team that you're working with hears about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And then if you can, fine tune your prospecting based on it, and then disqualify more. And then that way you don't burn a relationship in the market by trying to hound them when the timing isn't right, but you're building that trust over time. So they will come to you when they're ready.
That's right. I agree. I mean, maybe one quick story to cap off this topic on timing.
Please.
So I spent a year in valuation consulting, built kind of big Excel models to value different types of technology. And I was young, first day on the job. I wanted to make a really good impression on the VP that I was going to be working with. And I got staffed to work directly with the VP as opposed to a manager on a very kind of small project. And it was an awesome opportunity for me. So I walk into his office, I knock on the door, and I'm like, "Hi, Chris. I'm Nate. I'm new here. Was told that we're going to be working together." And he was kind of a stoic guy. So without saying anything, he was just sitting at his desk writing something down. And so I'm sitting there, and he goes, "Nate, what's the most important thing in life?" And doesn't look up. "Nate, what's the most important thing in life?" And so I'm like, "I don't know, like education. That sounds right. Education is the most important thing." And he's like, "No, no, timing is everything." And that was the first interaction that I had with him. And it was the most important thing to him. And so I've kind of watched for that to like be true over my career. And like, it's always stuck with me because I found that to be true. Timing is everything, exactly as the hashtag in the comment thread right now.
Timing is everything. It's,
Hmm.
yeah. Deals come at the right times. And if you don't, oh, actually, that leads me into another question that I've been getting a lot. Do you show slides during your discovery?
Good question. Personally, I don't. However, I don't think that that is a blanket, hey, cut slides from discovery overall. Personally, it's my way of becoming more conversational. Throughout my career, I have always tried to avoid coming across inauthentic. And my personality type, I tend to be a bit more of a performer than anything. And that, when a prospect sees that I'm presenting or pitching in a certain way, it kind of puts up this like zone of resistance, as it's called, defense. And so for me, getting away from slides is a way for me to stay very conversational and relational. However, I do know sellers that are very effective. Bilal did a session on this recently where he talked about why he uses slides in his discovery and the purpose of those things. And I do think it can be done effectively if it is used to frame up a question. So, for example, you might be sharing quotes from customers saying, "Hey, this was what life was like. It sucked before we found this product." And so you may say, "I'm curious to what extent this problem resonates with you." And so the function of this slide is to put a face, a customer face, and a specific quote to your question to say, like, and maybe you're providing some insights through that to say, like, this is why people come and talk to us, and this is a meaningful conversation. Curious to what extent that resonates. I think that's a great way to use it. But again, go back to what works for your style and what can help you just stay authentic in the conversation.
Love it. Now, what about starting new discovery sessions? So, you're working on an enterprise deal. It's probably not going to be one discovery session.
Correct.
So,
Uh-huh.
how would you start that next meeting? A lot of people tell me they dive in and they kind of keep going on their list. And
Hmm.
then some of the top sellers have said, no, like we always summarize. So they frame it, this is what you told me.
Hmm.
Is that correct? How do you go about it?
So this is a case where I do like slides if you're going into a second, a third, or a fourth conversation, especially if other people are joining the conversation for the first time. And there's a couple of reasons. One, when you put something in written form, it feels more concrete or permanent. And so if there is something that either is inaccurate or just incomplete, it's not the full story, people just feel the need to correct that. And they are
Mm,
much more likely to open up and either change or share more context. So that's where written form is not the same, even if it's the same approach of like recapping, this is what we heard last time. Written form is more effective, number one. Number two, if somebody is showing up for the first time in the conversation, you can't assume that they actually did get a recap passed on to them inside of an agenda, an email. They may just be like, well, this was on my calendar. They said it was important, so I'm going to show up and see what this is all about. And if they're coming from a different team, a different background, role, level, it's very important to have their perspective or point of view in as well. And if they're thinking about it differently and you jump down one track that was based on what that first person told you, you may be missing something. And so it allows you the chance to say, "Hey, Nick, you weren't part of the last conversation. I was talking with Jeffrey and he shared this. I'm curious, maybe from your perspective or role, is there anything outside of what I've captured here that you think is important to raise on this topic?" And then what I'll actually do is I will open up the slide in like native form as opposed to presentation form. And I'll be typing up kind of the key points that he's sharing as we're going so that they see that I'm listening. They see what I'm capturing. And again, back to this idea of like permanence in written form, they can help to fill in either incomplete or inaccurate, maybe notes that I'm capturing along the way.
I have never thought to screen share and show my notes.
Oh, yeah.
But it's so true. If you write something wrong, because when you're collaborating with anyone, no, that's not quite what I said. I said this. They will always correct you, and it's not. It's just natural. That's what we do as humans.
Yeah. And if you think about what you do with your own internal team, it's the same approach that you want to take in a sales conversation. Because as an internal team, and it doesn't have to be slides. Let's say, you guys use Google Docs and that's your thing. You'd open a Google Doc, you'd be typing notes and you'd be like, okay, Morgan, this is for you, like at Morgan, make sure to follow up on this by the 3rd. And then you keep going. And so it turns what can be I'm sitting across the table and selling to you to now we're in a more collaborative working session. We're doing this together. I'm in it with you. And it totally changes the posture in the environment that you've created. And when you do that, it's amazing. You'll find just a new level of openness and transparency that begins to develop as you go deeper into that conversation.
Yeah, I had somebody for one of the first times send me a document and ask if I could edit in line.
Mm-hmm.
And I just never thought of it, but they knew that we use Google Docs, so it was easy for us to go and jump in. And Morgan being away in Italy, he's like, at your whatever is convenient for you, jump in. And it was the collaborative element changed the way I approached that conversation. And it's just in thinking about it now, it's like, yeah, like we became team versus me being on the outside looking in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Quick story on this. This morning, I woke up to a DM from an account executive that sells in the HR space. And earlier in the week, we had done a coaching session and I shared over Google Docs some basic frameworks that you can use to put together a message with your champion. Now, his big problem that we were talking through in the coaching session is that in the HR space, it's very difficult to get a deal done because you have so many different business units outside of HR that have to approve a purchase. So oftentimes the people that you're talking with, even if they're up at VP of HR, they may not have decision-making authority. And so in this particular case, he's like, we really need to get the CFO involved in every deal. And it's very challenging to do this. How do I get to the CFO? So on what he tried is he developed a Google Doc, a working session with the VP of HR. They put together the message. That VP of HR added their CFO into it and was like, hey, here's the summary of the problems that I'm saying, what it means, why we need your feedback. Would you be up for a conversation on this? Next week, he has a call with the CFO scheduled. And so it goes back to this idea, how can you come alongside of, in this case, he was selling with the VP of HR, putting together that document in a more collaborative way. Now he's part of an internal discussion that typically he wouldn't be in the room for. It would be that VP HR, the CFO talking together, and then they bring whatever the outcome was back to him.
Unbelievable. Guys, as you're listening, we're in our last 10 minutes here, so please throw any questions you have in the comments. And then after the show today, I will go and send you Nate's playbook. But one that I keep getting asked, Nate, is I really struggle with going from my champion to everyone else. And I don't know who everyone else is. Do you have any advice on how to map that out and how to get started?
Yeah. So one of the first things that I would do is ask, hey, is there anybody that you think might feel left out if they weren't part of this next conversation or this next piece? And the reason why I like that more is that the typical perspective is more of a, hey, who's the decision maker on this? And I cringe because I used to ask that question early in my career. So are you the decision maker or who is? And if you just frame it around who would feel left out, that's one way to approach it. Two, if you get them thinking through a hypothetical scenario or situation that they are already a customer and they were using this tool, have them walk through a week in the life. So for example, Nick, I'm curious, if you were to implement this tool next week, 2 weeks down the road, can you walk me through a week in the life of using this tool? What do you think that would look like? Who would be part of that? And then you can hear the different people who would be involved. what their role is or relationship to it. And then you can begin to, one, map that out, but then two, suggest who would be relevant in which conversation. And there may, by the way, be a series of conversations that you actually want to set up, because what somebody on like an info security team is going to be asking about is totally different from this other team over here. And if you mix those two groups inside of a conversation, that's not helpful. So it's not only who's involved, but like what's their interest or their perspective on that. And then three, the reason why I do like this collaborative idea of documentation is because you can begin to see, as people begin getting active and commenting, there are some shadow players that might pop up sharing comments. And typically those are more of the people who are blockers than anything else. So for example, if somebody in procurement will have to get involved at some point, but you have no idea who they are, they're not really, perhaps relevant up front in the demo, you could tag them and say, hey, thinking ahead, is there somebody who needs to review X? Curious who that would be. Maybe you could tag them here so they can take a look. One other way to go about it.
Framing is such a powerful thing. It changes the whole tone of everything, and it's fun hearing the differences, just how you said it. And yeah, thinking back to my like old cold calling days, and like before like research was something I realized was important, like asking for the decision maker. That sets a tone that it's hard to come back from.
Oh yeah, it screams, hey, I'm here to sell you something.
I like how you go and frame it into the day to day too, because now you're becoming part of their day to day, and now you're going to support them. Because I think that's where a lot of sellers, we forget that for people to see the value, it has to be implemented.
Mm-hmm.
And if we don't throw up, I don't know the red flags, but discuss what could go wrong, I'd rather have it come up at the start, us figure it out and have a game plan, than it die, 80, 90% of the way done because they realize that it's a problem and they weren't ready.
Oh yeah, I agree. That's actually one of my favorite things to do when you have figured out or confirmed that you've secured a champion. They're totally committed and they want to help sell internally. You can actually flip your roles. You know all of the objections that have derailed deals in the past. Like you know exactly what has killed deals. And so start throwing some of those things at them and be like, I'm kind of interested. Like implementation isn't easy. It's going to take like 4 or 5 weeks at the minimum. You're in the team meeting a little later this week that you mentioned, and I'm sure they're going to ask about that. I'm curious your take on that. And whatever that objection is that you find in your quote postmortem, when you're looking back at all those dead deals and saying, why did these die out? Bring those back. When you have a champion that's committed, start sharing that with them, listen for what they're saying. And hey, you can start playing the role of coach. You get coaching, battle cards, all of it. Like you're given so many resources as a seller. But if that buyer or that champion is going to be part of meetings that you're not always in internally, it's part of your job to give that to them, give them some of your playbook. But again, that comes at the point at which you've already secured that commitment from the champion. They're excited to help you sell internally.
I love it. I wish I would have known this. I wish I would have met you 5 or 10 years ago. That would have changed my entire career. Going back in my head, I was like, I could have changed that. Also, too, like the new tools that we have. And I don't see enough people taking advantage of it, like video recordings. Mm-hmm. Do you send video recordings, or do you edit them down and then throw them in the doc so they're just seeing the relevant points?
Yeah. So, and by the way, if we had met 5 to 10 years ago, I would have been learning all of this the hard way, failing mistakes. So I wouldn't have been able to articulate this at the time. So, hey, timing is everything, right? We're talking when I can't actually share this. So, video. So I love the role of video in the sales process, particularly when you are trying to communicate something in a way that you're not totally confident that the prospect may be able to communicate. So what I'm more a fan of is capturing a short video after the fact. If there were maybe 1 or 2 points that you saw like this aha moment, like they really came alive at that point in the demo, afterward, go back to that, recap why that was important and why that matters to the person that you want the video to reach at the end of the day. So again, go back to, if you're talking with a manager, it needs to go to the VP. So re-record that one specific point that the manager loved in the demo and frame the importance of it or the value of it around what the VP is responsible for and cares about, and then send that clip. Don't just link, hey, here's the gong link, all 60 minutes, have at it. Not the approach. The more tailored, curated video, I think, is the way to go.
I thinking even on thinking from the flip side and the buyer side, like how much easier that makes it. Because now, so like even when somebody leaves a really nice, crisp comment, it's easy to respond to. But when somebody gives you a huge novel when they want it to be a conversation,
Mm-hmm.
it can really easily kill the flow. But now you got this nice, like short and sweet, and it's like you're talking about your summary. Now it's easy for them to respond or
Mm-hmm.
start a conversation themselves.
Yes, I agree. And the magic number that I found is to have that video clip starting with a 1. So make it a minute and 53 seconds, 58 seconds, or so on. Don't let it go above. If it is, then you can create multiple different clips linked to a place in the follow up where it's more relevant to that one point. People are much more likely to actually watch and follow through on that clip if they see, oh, it's like a minute, something, okay, I can watch this. When you start getting up into 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes, begin to split those out. Maybe you make 2, 3, 4 different clips and then anchor it to a point in the follow up where it's most relevant.
Visual support. I love it. Yeah, Nate, you're selling on a whole different level, my friend. I love it.
Well, I'll maybe if there are no other questions, I'll maybe leave. Could I leave one last kind of mental model or framework that I've
Yes,
loved
please.
throughout my career? Okay. So a lot of VP of sales will look at pipeline velocity, and it's kind of a good like overall metric to know, hey, is the team trending in the right way?
Yeah.
There's a version of this that I created and would have each of my individual AEs focus on, and it's deal velocity. So getting back to the whole idea or the theme of today is like, how do you avoid a deal from dying out on you after the demo? So you want to make sure that you are creating as much momentum as you possibly can or velocity within a individual or a single deal. And the way that I think about deal velocity or the formula for that is the number of buyer interactions times the number of stage advances or points throughout you've pushed the deal further or more qualified down the pipeline, divided by the level in the organization that you influenced. So number of buyer interactions times the number of stage advances divided by, here's the denominator, the level of organization that was influencing. So the reason why each of those things are super important is number one, number of buyer interactions. You can spend as much time as you want making follow-up calls, sending checking in emails, and so on. All that matters is the responsiveness of the buyer. Are they actually responding and following up to that? Or, I mean, ideally, are they unprompted, reaching back out to you? And how often is that occurring? Number one. And then two, are those touch points effective? Like if it is effective, you're moving a deal from like stage 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, all the way down the pipeline. And then the denominator is the level in the organization. So the CEO is top level. So that's number one. Then you go down to the second level, the third level, the fourth level, so on. Obviously, the more interactions at the higher the level, the more you're going to be able to create momentum in the deal. So if 3 times unprompted, a CEO reaches out to you and says, hey, I want a follow-up call, and each one of those is moving the deal one stage, like that is an incredible deal velocity. Go back to the formula, 3 interactions, advancing at 3 stages divided by 1, it's an executive level. So you're not reducing the output there. That is like you have a very alive and a very well deal that is humming right along. So deal velocity, it's kind of the mental model that I use. How responsive, how often are the buyers interacting with me? Are those interactions advancing the stage? And then lastly, who and at what level in the organization am I interacting with? Deal velocity.
I love it. I think of prospecting and like how to go and open those deals that are going to make or break your quarter or like really help the company grow. And you're looking at, win-loss analysis. Well, now if your pipeline velocity is one thing, but deal velocity and knowing those touch points throughout, not only does it open doors to reactivate deals, but it also gives me that insight of how to open the right deals, where deals are dying, and really put the buyer first. But if we only ever focus on like pipeline, then it's all about the sales process and not the buyer. So it flips it all the way around. I love that. Now you can be proactive. Now you can go and really show that you care in the process that you're taking. Thank you so much, Nate.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Nick. And great takeaway. Awesome to be here, and I love the topic for the day. So thanks for setting it up.
Absolutely. Now, Nate, people know you're on LinkedIn. Is there anywhere else that they can follow you?
Yeah, so you can go check out Fluent, FLUINT.io. Check out the blog. That's where we post new resources. So as I'm continuing to kind of think about and write on new topics, tactics, frameworks, formulas, you'll find them there on the blog.
Oh, where is that? I'll throw it in the comments, but you did a really good article the other day on how to revive dead deals. Was it on
Yeah.
Sales Hacker?
So there's a Sales Hacker post, 7 creative ideas to revive a dead deal without just checking in. So that was on Sales Hacker. Definitely would recommend giving that one a read too.
Anyone, if you want to go and really up your discovery and get those big deals, talk to Nate, download his book. If you don't already have it, just write in the comments. I'll make sure you guys get it. And Nate, thank you so much. And everyone, thank you so much for being here. It means a lot. We really appreciate it. And we really appreciate your time, Nate. Thank you so much.
Likewise. Thanks, everybody. Have a good weekend.
Take care, everyone.